Okay, today's daf we're going to be learning is another great daf, Yevamot Kuf Tet Zayin. Again, nearing the end of this Masechet, we're getting some great dafim. I'll remind you again to register for the siyum. Everything's up. So again, there'll be a bunch of siyums around Israel. There's actually an English one in Beit Shemesh. If anyone's interested in an English one, there's a bunch of other siyumim around Israel. There's also local siyumim in America in some different places, through all kind of organized through the WhatsApp communities. If you're in a community and they haven't organized one, you can definitely suggest just a small get-together. If you want to come to the Zoom siyum, which I hope we'll see you all there. We're now going to have some interesting things, as I mentioned yesterday. We have Dean Rachel Friedman, who's going to be from Lamdenu, who's going to be speaking about the biblical kind of idea of Yibum and kind of get to a more machshavti, philosophical perspective on like what's the concept behind it. And we're going to have my husband, Rabbi Seth Farber, speak about the courts, what's going on nowadays, practical implications of our Masechet, connecting things to sugyot that we learned. That, yes, I see you're saying, all right, everything was interesting. Yes, just some more complicated than others and some a little more interesting than others. But he'll kind of bring to life a bunch of the sugyot that we saw and see the practical implications of them. So it'll be a very interesting combination of things. And then we'll hear from one of our learners, her experience learning Masechet Yevamot from Elizabeth Kirshner. So it's really going to be a great program. And anyone who can't come on the Zoom, it's always recorded. It's always up on the site. You can link to it from the day's daf post. And one last thing that I told you last time, but in case you didn't hear every shiur. So Thursday, this is really, really important because Thursday we're going to be learning in the morning the beginning of the daf. So when you come to the siyum, we're not learning the entire daf of the siyum. We're only learning from the Mishna at the bottom of Amud Aleph to the end. So make sure when you get to the siyum on Sunday that you've already learned through the first part of the daf, which will be up on the site, and then you can learn the siyum daf. The end of the daf we'll learn together. We'll finish together as usual. Okay, starting from the bottom of Kuf Tet Vav Amud Bet. So what happened yesterday's daf? At the end of yesterday's daf, we had this story about this two people. Do you have to be concerned that there's two people with the same name? Oh, thank you, the dedication. Forgot entirely. Okay, good, I have people to remind me. Today's daf is sponsored by Sarah Borelowitz in honor of her granddaughter Avishag Sturman on her bat mitzvah, Mazal Tov. And today's daf is sponsored by Susanna and Bernie Goldstein in honor of their children Eliana and Benny, who went back to Camp Ramah in the Poconos this week for the summer. We're so proud of you, wishing you and all the tzevet and the chanichim a fun, safe, and healthy summer. Okay, so we were talking about do you have to be concerned that when somebody comes and testifies, this person is dead? Do we have to worry that maybe there's another person with the same name? And there's been some confusion here. So, if you looked at CNN yesterday, you might have noticed that there was a great article about two women who have the exact same name, and their name is a bit of a rare name. Okay, I'll find it for you. 1 second. There was an article about these two women who basically I'll tell you the name of the article, how two women with the exact same name became best friends. And it's a story about these two women whose names are Kimberly Flieger, okay, Pfliegr, who not only have the same name, they spell it the same way, and they basically knew of each other's existence for all these years, and eventually, one writes to the other, and they knew of their existence because their name is so strange that if you put it in Google, you find there's another person with the same name. Anyway, they finally meet up. They got in touch a little before Corona, and then after Corona they meet up, and we're not exactly after, but whatever. They now were able to meet up, and they became best friends basically, and they feel like they're very close. Anyway, it's just a funny story about two people with the same name that happened to be on CNN yesterday. So it's exactly our question here, right? Can you assume it's that person, or I knew someone would find it right away and send. Is it the exact same? Do you have to worry that there's another person with that name or not? So Rava said you don't have to worry. Of course, you can assume we're talking about the guy. And Abaye says no, you have to be concerned. And each one brought a different proof. And we finished with Rava's proof, which was actually about a totally different issue. And good question how he brings this up as an issue, because monetary law and a raya, eshed ish, married woman, are not usually judged in the same way. But he brings up a case of a promissory note and how it had, right, it's kind of funny that one guy's name was Chavi Barnani and one was Nani Barchave, which is the opposite. But it's really talking about two separate cases, one with Chani Barnani and one with Nani Barchave. And basically, even though there's lots of people with that name, which sounds a little surprising, but The point being that they let each one collect their promissory notes. So what do you see here? We're obviously not concerned that it was someone else's. To which Abaye says, and now we're starting with the last word on yesterday's stuff, Abaye l'may nichushla. I don't even understand what the issue would be. Of course we allow him to collect, irrespective of our case. Our case is totally different. There's a promissory note. What do we know about promissory notes? So first of all, if I have a promissory note, it's, okay, first of all, my maiden name was Michelle Cohen. Now, I had another girl in my grade whose name was Michelle Cohen, and she went to camp with me. Forget about every time we got packages delivered. Okay, they would say Michelle Cohen to the, talking about camp and the dedication. Michelle Cohen to the, come get your package. And it was always miserable because, it ended up being hers, not mine, or mine, not hers. Everyone was always disappointed. So he says the following. What are you worried about? If me, Michelle Cohen, takes out a promissory note that says you owe Michelle Cohen money, of course it's mine, right? Even if we're worried that I dropped it and the other Michelle Cohen picked it up and said, oh, great, I'm going to go collect this money. People don't just drop their promissory notes. That's all. It's like losing, right, a check, or a check at least someone could rewrite. But, you take care of your wallet, you take care of your promissory notes. You don't just drop them. Ila pikadon, if it's let's say, the other Michelle Cohen asked me to watch her promissory note. She wouldn't do that. Because kevan deshami kishmei lo mafkikabe. She'd find anybody else but someone with the same name to watch a promissory note, because I can obviously just claim it's mine and go collect it. So my Amar, so what else could it be? Dilma masarle. Maybe I gave it to her, meaning I gave it to her as a gift, or I sold it to her, and I said, you can go collect the money. Now, what's the issue? Well, maybe I gave it to her in a way that it wasn't really a kinyan, and I wanted to change my mind, and I wanted it back. And then, meaning it wasn't ever really a good kinyan. It wasn't really ever hers. And I want it back for myself. So now they say, wait, but if that's the case, there is no such thing as no good kinyan. Because otiyot niknop misira. There's this concept, and this comes up a lot, and we're not going to go into it so much today, but otiyot niknop misira means words, meaning a document, a shtar, which would include this promissory note, is acquired by handing over it. As soon as I hand it over to her, that's the kinyan. Okay, we'll get much more into kinyanim when we get to kiddushin, but that's it. So she owns it. So if that's the case, I can't claim it's mine. So basically, there is no situation, according to Abaye, that we have to worry it's somebody else's. It's obviously mine. I have it in my hands. I take it, etc. Okay. Now we're going to have a situation that happened. Okay, now we talked about, right, first we were talking about testimony for a person, right? Is a person dead? Then we moved to promissory notes to use that as a proof. And now we're going to have a situation with a get. Okay? There's a divorce document. We're now going to have a case where Abaye and Rava switch positions. Hahu Gita, the Ishtakach Besura. There was a get they found in Surah. Uktiv Behachi. And it said the following in the get. Besura Mata, in the city of Surah, this is in Bavel. It's a city in Bavel, one of the main cities. In the city of Surah, Anan Barchia, me, Anan Barchia, Nahardea, from Nahardea, Patrit, what's the word? I kind of let her leave, Vitarachet, and I divorced her. Okay, I freed myself of her, Patar, I don't know exactly how you translate it, Vitarchet, and I divorced her. Plonit Intite, so-and-so, my wife. Ubadku habana misura v'nahardea, v'lo hava Anan Barchia achrina. They checked from Surah to Nahardea, the biggest cities there. They checked from there to there, and they didn't find any other Anan Barchia other than him. Other than Levarmi, other than one other Anan Barchia, Michagra, from the city of Chagra. Tahava ben Nahardea, who happened to have been in Nahardea at the time. Va'atu Sadeh va'amur dahu yoma, ki ichtivahu gita, Anan Barchia Michagra gaban hava. He was in Nahardea, and witnesses came and said, listen, that day that this get was written in Surah, this Anan Barchia Michagra was by them, in Nahardea. So we know he wasn't in Surah on that day. So now we know facts on the ground. We know there are two Anan Barchias. We know that the other one, who we don't think it's his get anyway, right? In other words, he's not claiming it's his get. The wife of the first Anan Barchanan is claiming it's his get. The other one was in Nahardea at the time. Okay? So, because he was in Nahardea, we can assume he wasn't in Surah writing and giving the get. he doesn't write the get, the Sofrim write the get, but the get was given them, we assume he was in him. So now they say, Amar Abaye, Af Lididi, Da'amina Chashinan, Hachalo Chashinan, Daka'amr Sadid B'nahar Da'ava. Even though normally I'd be worried there's someone else with that name. In this case, I'm not worried because the guy with the same name was in a different city. There's nothing to worry about. So Abaye switches his position in this specific case. Amar Rava, and therefore my Baya Basura. Okay, I've missed the last three words, right? Since the witness says he was in Nahar Da'ava, he couldn't have been in Surah. Well, Amar Rava, Af L'didi de lo chashinan hacha chashinan. Here normally I'm not concerned. Okay, now normally, what's normally? Rava is not concerned that if a woman comes and says, this is my get, and I'm divorced from this man, we don't worry, maybe it's some other man. Because Rava says you don't have to start searching for looking, right? We don't know that there's two people. You don't have to go looking to see if there's someone else with the same name. But if you know that there's someone with the same name, then you have to be worried. In other words, this is what we call huchzak. Once it's a known thing, then it's a known thing. And then, basically, you need to worry about it. Now, what about the fact that he was in Nahar Da'ava? So he gives three possibilities. Two of these, by the way, come up in Sanhedrin when it comes to witnesses. If we know the witnesses were somewhere at a certain hour, and then they claim 2 hours later they were somewhere else where normally the journey is way longer than 2 hours, the Gemara says, okay, if you think the Gemara wasn't forward thinking, okay, they say here, maybe begamla parcha azo. Maybe he went on a flying camel. Okay, it's a great line. It's like talking about airplanes in the time of the Gemara. Okay, right? What a flying camel is, we don't really know, but I assume he just means by some crazy way. He had. Actually, was talking about this the other day. Daughter's in a hasa'ah. She gets to school with a taxi. So the woman who goes with her told me the other day that when this one driver comes, he gets her there like in crazy amount of time. And I looked and I said, there's no way you could get from there to there in that amount of time. There's just no way, right? So there's certain people who are crazy drivers, right? And can somehow make, Waze might say 35 minutes and, they make it in 25 minutes. So I don't know if you want to be in the car with them, but, right, they know how to do it. So maybe there's animals, right, who can get there in a crazy fast manner. Must be talking about something like that. Inami bikfitza, or maybe by jumping. Okay, what's jumping? This isn't jumping literally. Also, there were like these beliefs that miraculously somehow you could get from one place to the other. And he's basically saying maybe by some miraculous nature. What this really means is you have to be concerned for all possibilities. Yes, it's true he was there then, but maybe there's some way he could have gotten there. The third option is a little more of a normal option. Inami mile masar. Maybe he just told the witnesses, go write this get for me and give it to the woman. Remember, shlucho shel adam kamoto. He doesn't need to be there. No one ever said he was there at the time when the get was written and given to her. He doesn't have to be there, so he could have been Nahar Da'ava, but told the witnesses, go do this. They did it. They wrote it. They gave it in Sula. Now, if the husband was in Nahar Da'ava and told the witnesses to do it in Surah, the question is, where would you write? What would you write in the get? So now they're going to tell you. And Keda'amrlu Rav l'Safrai, just like Rav told his Sofrim, his scribes, and B'chein Amrlu Rav Huna l'Safrai, Rav Huna also told his scribes that if you're in the kind of situation like this, Ki itnechu b'shile, if you're in Shile, that's the name of a place, K'tovu b'shile, write Shile in the get. Even though you got the order to write the get in Hini, okay, which is exactly our case. At least what he's suggesting could be our case. And I don't know why the second line is there because it's obvious, but and if it's the reverse, that you're in Shile, that you're in Hini, and he told you though in Shile you would write Hini and not Shile. Okay, I don't know why you had to give that case. They're really basically it's just saying the same thing. Okay. So now we have, interesting, right, that why did we bring this case? Because it gets more under there, like what's exactly going on. So again, Rava, if there's no chazaka, you don't have to go looking to see, is there someone else with the same name? But once you know there's someone with the same name, then we have to be concerned. Whereas Abaye is concerned from the beginning, you have to worry. In this particular case, since we had testimony that the guy wasn't there, he was willing to rely on that. And again, this is get, this isn't death. So again, it's a different kind of case. Now we're going all the way back. I don't know why. This really should have been on yesterday's stuff, but we had this case about the shumshumim, the sesame, that a guy had given sesame to someone to watch, and then he claimed that the sesame was mine, right? I want it back. And the guy said, what are you talking about? I already gave you back your sesame. This is some other sesame, right? And then we said, is it simanim? He said, I had 5 pounds worth, and and it was in this barrel. Not necessarily, because chayshinan shema pinam, right? You have to be concerned that maybe he took those out, and these are other ones, right? Which was similar to the story of the guy went into the fire, maybe the guy went out of the fire, right? And then we had those other cases of kuf for korban and this for that. Are we concerned that people move things out of other things or not? So the question is, my have'alai d'shum shemei, what do we hold? So they say, Rav Yemar Amar lo cheshinan, Ravina Amar cheshinan. Okay, so Rav Yemar says, we're not worried. We're not concerned that you move things. Ravina says, we are concerned you might have moved things, which means the guy doesn't get his money back, because it could be it's not the same items. V'hilchata cheshinan, and we paskin like Ravina, that he can't get his sesame seeds back because they might not have really been his. Okay, now we go back to the Mishnah. Tata. Remember, we had 2 issues in the Mishnah. We have a woman who comes and testifies about her husband that he died. We accept the testimony unless time of war, which we dealt a lot with, or they had a ktata, fight between them. What is ktata? We want to know now. Hechidami ktata beino lebeina. We know lots of couples, unfortunately, right, that argue all the time. Unfortunate, not fortunate, maybe it's just part of relationships, but people argue a lot. So where do you draw the line? On an argument between 0 to 10, on what part of the scale are we going to put this ktata? So, Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Ba'omeret leBa'ala gar sheni. She says to her husband, divorce me. To which the Gemara says, what are you talking about, right? Like, I want a divorce, yeah? So, Kulu name amre hachi. All women say that when they're in a fight with their husbands. Hopefully, you haven't said that to your husbands, but, it does happen. People say things in a moment of anger that they later regret, right? If you haven't said the words, I want to divorce you, you might have said other words that you really regret. And 10 minutes later, you've gotten over it, or a day later, or whatever it might be, and you're like, I didn't really mean that. So that wouldn't be a ktata. That's a line that people say all the time. Well, Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel, I went back by accident. Ella, be'omeret leba'ala gerashtani. So when she says to her husband, you divorced me already. That's a woman who's really in a serious ktata with her husband. The Gemara says, wait a minute. That's not a good answer, because, and we're going to learn something else, if she says to her husband, you divorced me already, she's actually believed that he divorced her, which means she's not even married, which means she doesn't need to come to court and say, he's dead, because she's not even married anyway. How do we know this? Mida Rav Amnuna. Da'amar Rav Amnuna, Isha she'amra leba'ala gerashtani, a woman who says to her husband, you divorced me, ne'emen, she's believed, and she can come into a court of law and say, I'm divorced, and she can go remarry. Chazaka ein isha mi'izat paneh b'fnei ba'ala. Why? Because we assume someone is not, this is where we get into the world of chazaka, we've talked about this recently. We can make assumptions about human behavior. Nobody goes, by the way, this comes up also, chazaka ein adam me'iz panav b'fnei ba'al chovo. You wouldn't go and say to someone who lent you money, I paid you back already, when you didn't really pay them back, because they know you didn't pay them back. So you wouldn't have the chutzpah, the audacity to say such a thing. So now, remember that I use the word chutzpah. I'm going to get back to that word in a minute. But basically, they say a woman wouldn't have the chutzpah to go in front of her husband, or the audacity to go in front of him and say, you divorced me, when he knows he didn't divorce her. So she must be telling the truth. There's no way a woman would say that if she didn't really mean it. To which the Gemara answers, Be'omeret gerashtani b'fnei ploni u'ploni, u'she'il nevamru lo hayu dvarim me'olam. It's a case where she says to him, you divorced me in front of so-and-so. And then, what happened? They asked the witnesses, and the witnesses said, I don't know what she's talking about. We never witnessed this divorce. Now, so while we have this concept of chazaka only works if you don't have something strong operating against it. If you now have witnesses saying, I don't know what she's talking about, and she even said it was in front of these witnesses, then we have witnesses against the chazaka, and the witnesses win out. That's the case. Now, we've already gotten into a very narrow case of ktata. It would have to be a case where the woman said, you divorced me in front of witnesses. The witnesses, I don't know what she's talking about. Then we're going to assume this woman just wants out. Okay? And she's lying to get out of it, in which case we're going to think that she's lying when she says her husband's not alive anymore. Now, why do I want to mention this word chutzpah? Because, very interestingly, if you look in the halacha about this, so first of all, I want to go just backwards. In other words, not really our topic, but this topic that came up in the context of this discussion about this issue of believing a woman that her husband's dead. So first of all, the commentaries, their husband divorced her. In the case, she's not going to have the audacity to get up in front of him and say such a thing. So first of all, there's a debate among the commentaries whether we allow her to actually go get remarried based on this, or we don't really allow her, but it's right. We basically say, well, if she did anyway, then we'll say that the marriage is valid, because usually kiddushin aren't tofsim. Remember, the marriage isn't valid if she's married to someone else. So we'll use it kind of l'chumra and say, oh, you are actually married to the second guy. If you want to get divorced from him, you need a divorce. And we'll use it l'chumra, but not necessarily that we'll allow her to say, oh, you're actually unmarried entirely. That's one thing. The other thing that's interesting, it's not exactly the most, you're not going to like this, but I thought to bring it up anyway. The Rama, it was the commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, Ashkenazi from the 16th century. He says here, V'yesh omrim, some people say, oh, de bizman hazeh, in our day, okay, talking about in his time, de nefishe chutzpah upritzuta. There's a lot of people who have a lot of chutzpah and pritzuta. They don't really care about this whole thing of marriage and they're sleeping around with other people. Ein hane'emedet el l'chumah. He basically says, we're talking about human behavior. I said the other day how what's interesting about human behavior is that the things that the rabbis were insightful about often are still true today. Here's a good example of, they're saying, well, what was insight, into human behavior then has changed. Because, what do you mean people don't have the audacity? People are very chutzpahdik and will say anything in front of people. They don't really care anymore. Okay, things have changed in that way, and then the halacha needs to change as well. So then he says, you certainly wouldn't allow her to go get remarried based on this. You might say, l'chumra, right? You might say, partially we believe her, but not fully. Anyway, it's an interesting thing. It's an interesting comment. I wonder if he means just women are chutzpahdik, or in general, right? People are more audacious than they used to be. Anyway, it's an interesting line I thought worth mentioning. Okay, my time a diktata. So now they say, well, what's the logic behind this issue? If they're having an argument between them, why does that mean we're not going to believe the woman? Rav Chanina Amal, Mishum de Mishakha. Well, she hates him so much that she wants to basically get forbidden to him, right? So what's the best way to get forbidden to him? Well, say that he died. He shows up on the scene and now she'll never be allowed to marry him again. And right, unfortunately, you have to remember, women can't get out of marriage very easily, so this is a way to get out if she's really miserable. Rav Shimi bar Ashi Amal, Mishum da Amra b'didami. So again, now, because she doesn't like him, right? So she's not going to be so careful to check, right? The whole thing was, if she sees he's dying, she'll be like, oh great, he's dead, I can go now get married, right? Again, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but, which is why I said it with a smile, but, there's this concept of, remember, there's b'didami. She's not going to necessarily check so much. She'll just kind of assume. By the way, in Gefet, it's coming out today. It's not up yet, but it should be up later this morning. There's a whole, going into this whole thing about b'didame and edecha b'didame and this much more in depth, and I highly recommend it because these are the sugyot that it's very hard to learn without really delving in depth because they're fascinating and there's a lot of depth to them. Okay, so that should go up later today on our site. So now they say, my benai, what's the difference whether you say Dimashakra or bididame? So ikabenayu de argil hu ktata. What if he starts the ktata? Okay, what if he's the one who really hates her? She doesn't hate him as much. So then we're not really concerned she's going to lie. And she won't go outright lying because she doesn't hate him so, right? If she hates him, then yeah. But if he hates her, now remember we said the other day, the one who hates also ends up causing the other one to hate them. But assuming we don't exactly hold it, it's certainly not equal. So if he's the one who started the problems, then we're not worried that she's going to outright lie. But she still might do bididami, right? She still might think he's dead. Ibayalu. Now we ask the same question we asked about the war. When it came to the war, now remember, our Mishna is only talking about a woman who testifies about her own husband. Soon we're going to get to how unique this is and how, what prompted the rabbis to actually come up with this heter, to allow a woman to testify about herself, right? She's got 3 strikes against her. Number 1, she's a woman whose generally testimony is not accepted. Number 2, it's one witness as opposed to usually you need 2. And number 3, and which is the most strong, she's what we call nogea b'davar. It so directly impacts her, and we don't usually allow testimony that impacts you directly. So soon, the next Mishnah is going to talk about, actually in a roundabout way, it's going to mention that there was some event that happened, some case, that caused the rabbis to basically change their minds about this and say, we're going to accept this woman to testify about herself. But the question now, right now is, okay, so she is not believed in a case of ktata. What about a different witness, Eid Echad? The whole heter of Eid Echad is also pretty similar. The fact that we can accept one witness. So we asked last time, do we accept one witness in Zman Milchama? In the end, we brought some sources, but we weren't able to decide. Here also, we're not going to be able to decide, but we'll see the two sides of the question. Why they think it's a question. Eid Echad b'ktata ma'u. My time of the Eid Echad mehema mishum demilta David de l'gilueh lo meshakel. Do we say Eid Echad is believed because, again, it's something that will ultimately be revealed? V'hachanami lo meshakel. And therefore, here too, it's the same thing. What's the difference if there was a ktata between them? In the end, it's something that will ultimately be revealed. And therefore, we're not worried he's going to lie. We will accept Eid Echad and a ktata. O dilma, tama de Eid Echad mehema mishum dihi daika uminsaba. Remember, it's got two parts to it. Number one, we assume he's not going to really lie, because eventually the guy might walk in the door and then he'll look like an idiot. But the second issue is that we assume, why do we believe the Eid Echad? Because we're not fully relying on the Eid Echad. We're relying also that the woman does her own research and is going to check whether or not he actually is dead. Now, that is only going to hold true in what case? In a case where she really wants her husband to be alive. But when she's happy to get out of the marriage, she's not going to really do her homework properly. So, so since she doesn't really want to be married to this guy anymore, maybe she'll be very happy she got this one witness, and she's not going to do any more research, and therefore they end with teku. We don't really know whether we can accept one witness in a ktata or not. Okay, I didn't check what we paskin. If someone wants to look that up, you can. It's probably, if you have the Koran, there's probably a footnote. Usually they bring the footnote in there, how we hold. Be interesting to see, right? If you want, you can open. There's an aleph here. The aleph takes you, right? I'm telling you the easy way, but the other way is there's a little aleph by the word Eid Echad b'ktata, which sends you to the Amish Patner Mitzvah on the corner of the page. And there it quotes you where in the Rambam, Perik Yud Gimel, Mihul Gerushin Halacha Aleph, or you can look in the Shulchan Aruch, Even Ezer Siman Yud Zayin Sif Mem Chet. By the way, these are all super, super easy to find in Sefaria. If you look in their halacha section, you can just do that. So yeah, it makes sense that the Koran, thank you for telling us, Gita, that the Koran says we're machmir, which makes sense. Usually when there's a doubt, you always go l'chumra. You're stringent. Okay, next. Rabbi Yehuda Omer. La'olam eina, okay, So go back to the Mishnah. What did Rabbi Yehuda say? Rabbi Yehuda said at the end of the Mishnah, we only believe her if she comes crying and with torn clothing. Then we believe her. If she doesn't have any signs of avelut, then we think this woman's just, playing a game with us, trying to pull the wool over our eyes. So here we now get to a braita that has more of a discussion, or I wouldn't really say discussion, it's a one-sided. It's what the rabbis, their response to Rabbi Yehuda. And it's a very unclear response, and I'll give you two commentaries of two different ways of reading this line. Amru lo Rabbi Yehuda, lidvarecha pikachat tinaseh, shota lo tinaseh, ela echad zo tinaseh. According to what you're saying, a woman who's a pikachat, who's not a shota, I'll say basically, can get remarried. But a shota, a woman who's a shota, right, who not of sound mind, can't get married. But that's wrong, because both she and she can get married based on her own testimony. What are we talking about here? What's the problem? Well, a shota, first of all, there's no real valid marriage by shota, and we certainly wouldn't accept a shota's testimony in court about anything because they're not of sound mind. So what are we talking about here? So one option is to say we're talking about a shota who has enough knowledge and enough, right? Again, we talked about this before. There's a range, there's a scale. So we're talking about a shota who is enough of sound mind to, yes, get married and, yes, accept her testimony their husband died. But not smart enough to, now what's the issue here? So again, it's a little bit strange what exactly the issue would be. And I don't really accept this. Not that I don't accept it. I don't think it's a good shot here. I found a better way of explaining it from a different commentary, not my own. But what they're saying here is that the shota, why is she not believed? If you need outward signs of crying and torn clothes, she might often be crying or like she's unstable as it is. So that wouldn't be a sign. If you need a sign that she's in avelut and mourning, you won't really be able to have a clear sign. Okay, and that's the concept here of what they're saying to him, in which case they say, your claim is clearly not true. But what I was thinking already from the beginning, when we read this Mishnah, which then I found a commentary who says this, Pikacha tinaseh means one who's smart, who knows how to work the system, will be able to get remarried based on this, because she'll know she's supposed to come to court crying, and she can just put on a show. We all know. You can fake cry, you can tear your garments and make it look like, right? It reminds me of the story with the Givonim, right? In Yoshua, they made themselves look like they were, right, from far away, the Nitinim that we've talked about, right? They made it look like they came from far away. They took moldy food with them and torn clothing, right? You can put on a show. So if you're smart, you'll put on a show and you'll get what you want, even though it's not really true. And if you're not smart, that's what they mean by shota. It's not that you're not smart or you're not willing to use some trickery here. And not only that, like, imagine yourself in that situation. Okay, your son's died. Savvy is a good way to say it. Street smart. Anyway, your husband died. You come to court to say he died. Now, and you're going to walk into court crying and with rended garments? No, you're going into court. You're going to pull yourself together. You're going to be composed. You're going to wear nice clothing because you want to make an impression. And you're going to pull yourself together specifically. And, if you say savvy street smart, theoretically, this woman who's a shota might be savvy and street smart enough to know I'm going into court. I got to pull myself together. I'm not going to cry, right? You can imagine yourself saying, don't lose it. And then, right, she is going to get hurt in the end because she doesn't know the halacha is she's supposed to be crying, and she's in the end not going to be able to get remarried. So they basically say, this is ridiculous, this criteria that you're requiring. However, here's an interesting situation. Hahid ita lebeidina de Rabbi Yehuda. There was a woman who came to the court of Rabbi Yehuda to get remarried, right? To say my husband died. Ambrela, the rabbis, she's on her way into court. They go to her. They say, listen, sfudi ba'alech kir'i manayich sitri mazayich. Okay, right? They must have not done it when she was on her way in, but they basically say before you go to court, they prepare her. Be mournful for your husband. Tear your clothes. Let your nails or your hair grow long, right? Look disheveled when you go in. So the Gemara says, Afu shikra? What, the rabbis taught her to lie? What's going on here? So they say, no. Inu kirabanan tzfiru. The people who gave her advice don't hold like Rabbi Yehuda. They don't say she needs this. So they believed her anyway. But Amrei tavid hachid ke'echad delishrei. They said to her, but you're going into Rabbi Yehuda's court. You got to prepare yourself for whose court you're going into and what you're going to need for that court. But this is very relevant nowadays, right? You go into a certain Beit, and whoever, all depends what dayanim you're going in front of. Certain dayanim hold certain ways, certain other dayanim hold other ways, and sometimes it's knowing which court to go to and which court not to go to, or at least when you're going into that person's court, know what their rules are and know what you have to do in order to get what your result. Obviously, it's not exactly playing the system, but it's knowing how to work the system. Again, we're not talking about people who are wrong in what they're doing. We're trying to just figure out, right, how to get unfortunately in the courts, and maybe I don't know if Seth will get to this at the Siyum, but there are lots of situations where you get to the court, you're totally right, but the judges have their own way of seeing things, and they don't see things your way, and it's very difficult. So, right, this is true in any court, right, whether it's court of Jewish law or any law. We all know that. Okay, new Mishnah. Beit Hillel Umbrim Lo Shaman. Okay, now we're going to get this Mishnah that the sugya is going to unfold a little bit in the wrong direction. Like you would have thought we'd start one way and then we get to this, but we're going to have to get to it in the typical way of the Gemara, a little bit out of order. Beit Hillel Umbrim Lo Shamanu Ela Beba'a Min HaKatzir Ube'ota Medina Ukema'aseh Shaya. Instead of thinking that, we accept one witness, as long as there's no, right, we accept a woman to testify about her husband, as long as there's no war and there's no ktata. Well, now Beit Hillel says, by the way, this is only if she's coming from harvesting, and it was in the same city where she lives, same area, same, I don't know how you translate Medina, same state area, ukema'aseh shaya. And like the case, what happened? Okay, I told you we're going to get to ultimately what the case is. Okay? אמרו להם בית שמאי, אחת הבאה מן הקציר, אחת הבאה מן הזיתים, אחת הבאה מן הבציר, אחת הבאה ממדינה למדינה. לא דיברו חכמים בקציר, אלא בהווה. I'm going to go backwards. When the rabbis talked about katzir, what they said was, katzir, And they were talking about the case that happened, the harvest. But it could be the katsir, which is the harvest of the wheat. It could be the batsir, which is the harvest of the grapes. It could be the zaytim, the harvest of the olives. And it could even be in a different medina. Okay, I see the best translation I think I see a few people gave is really province. Countries weren't really countries then, or even medina doesn't exactly mean country, but it's more a province. That's a better way of saying it. So, province, okay? Even from a different province, doesn't matter. Okay, now, so chazru Beit Hillel lo ki Beit Shamai. In the end, Beit Hillel is convinced by Beit Shamai. You're going to see the exact same thing in the next Mishna, where Beit Shamai was lenient, Beit Hillel was stringent, and in the end, Beit Hillel is convinced by Beit Shamai's opinion. Right? We always think of Beit Shamai as being strict. Sometimes Beit Hillel is, and in fact, sometimes they're more strict. In this case, Beit Shamai was convinced. Okay, now we need to understand a little bit of background. We're not even going to get to the background yet, but first we're going to get to a Breita that has more description of the conversation between them. Amru lahem Beit Shamai le Beit Hillel l'divrachem. If you say it has to be exactly like it was, well, then it would have to be the harvesting of the grains and not the harvesting of the barley. And I know that even you agree with me that if you harvested barley, it would be fine. And it sounds like you're saying it would have to be specifically harvesting. What if it was some other activity in the field? Which also, you must agree with me about that. And that's basically what he's saying. The main disagreement we have is about the Medina, okay? But the other things you must agree with me. So, yes, the case was in the katsir, they were harvesting. But what's the difference? Any other action they were doing. And therefore, just because it was in the same province, it should be any place as well. In other words, if you're not going to distinguish there and make it exactly like the case, well, then you shouldn't distinguish also when it comes to where it was. To which Beit Hillel says, what do you mean? Beit Hillel ba'otam medina d'shchicha inashe mirtat. Medina l'medina acheret lo shchicha inashe lo mirtat. No, there's a logic. Katsir, batzil, oder, any of those activities, that has no relevance. But when it comes to the location, that's super important. Because if it happened in the same city, she's not going to lie because she knows people will find out. But if it happened far away, it's very easy to testify about something that happened far away. No one's really going to know. Happened out in the boondocks. The chances of him coming back are slim to none. And even if he is still alive. And basically, right, no one's going to be able to check properly because they're not going to go send messengers far away. Okay, remember, travel was much more complicated in those days. So there's less reason. Right there's more reason that she might think she can lie and get away with it. Beit Shamai says, what do you mean? He got there. Other people can get there. There's caravans that go back and forth. There's ways to get there. I don't buy that. Now, finally, we get to, okay, so my Maaseh Shaya, what was that case? It was the end of the season of the Ktsir Chitim, of the harvest for the grains. 10 men went to go harvest the grains. One of them got bitten by a snake. So ubat ishto v'hodia lebeitin. So his wife came and told the court that he died. Now, apparently, and this is the important part, none of the other 10 men that were there saw it. Okay, so part of this is going to be the rabbis realized even in a case where there's 9 other people there, nobody noticed that he died, and the only testimony we have to help this woman is her testimony. Now, how did they know they could believe her? Well, in this case, shalchu matzu kidvareha. They went out and they searched the place. They found his dead body. It had simanim on it. It was clear it was him. Bo'tasha amru haisha shemet ba'ali tinaseh. Shamra met ba'ali tinaseh. A woman that says my husband died can get remarried, or met ba'ali tityabem, or she can do yibum based on her own testimony. And so they realized a bunch of things. They realized, number one, it's sometimes you can think things in theory, but when they come in front of you, it affects the way you think about it. When you see a woman who's stuck and her husband is dead and she can't remarry, you see how much she's struggling. So they saw her personal struggle. They saw that she had told the truth. And they saw that it could be very common that we end up with a situation where somebody dies and just people didn't notice. Or didn't see. Okay? So, right, because here, when there's 9 other people and nobody knew that he had died, that sends, a message. Wow, this is a bad situation, and this could likely happen again. So because of that, they instituted, it's a great case, because the rabbis saw this need, particularly for women who might struggle, and they said, we have to change things. Now they're going to compare this to some other case we saw a while ago, and this will be to take us to the end of today's daf. Until the Mishna, we'll stop at the Mishna we'll do in tomorrow's. Name Rabbi Hananya ben Akiva Rabbanam beplukte de Beit Shamai Beit Hillel kamiflage. Seems like there's another machloket just like this. Deitanya lo yisa adam mechatat ve'efer chatat ve'yavirem bayarden ubesfina ve'lo yamo b'tzazev yizrok l'tzad acher. A person can't carry the para aduma waters, the red heifer waters, apropos our Parsha Chukat this week in Israel, ve'efer chatat, or the para aduma ashes, and take them in the Yarden, in the Jordan River, and in a boat. And not only not in the Jordan River and in a boat, but you can't stand on one side and throw it to the other side. And yes, I told you we had this. Yes, it was in Chagiga, good memory. And it's a Tosefta, by the way, in Masechet Para. And lo yishitem al pnei hamayim. You can't send them in a raft on the water. Lo yarkiveim lo al gabe be'emai. You can't even put them on an animal. V'lo al gabe chavero, not on someone's back. Ela im ken hayu raglav no go bekarka. Okay, the person carrying it has to have his feet on the ground. Ava maviram ala gesho. You can do it on a bridge because the person's walking on the bridge, so it's over the water, but no. Chadi or Dana Chacharna road, it doesn't matter. The Jordan doesn't matter, any kind of river. Rabbi Hananya ben Akavi Omer, Lo amru ela Yarden, ubesfina ukemase shaya. No, they only said in the Jordan and in a boat, just like the case that happened. Only at the end we're going to get to the case that happened. Again, we have to wait. But basically there was a case. Let's see what it was in a minute. Because of that case, they made a gzerah either in only exactly the way it was then, just like here, where they'll say only the way it was then, that was Beit Hillel. Or, right, one's a gzera, one's a takana, like to help people, one's to forbid. But anyway, the other side says, no, anything similar, we're going to basically say it's a problem. And then you have to just come up with what the criteria are that are similar. Lema Rabbanan Damar Kebet Shamai, Rabbi Hanina ben Akiva Damal Kebet Hillel. Okay, that's how they line them up. So then they say no. Amr lecha Rabbanan. Ana damrinan afilu af Kebet Hillel. Al kan lo kamer Beit Hillel hatamel mishum demirta. Kom karov mirta, and kom rachok lo mirta. It's not because do we make things just like or not. It's just things that are similar. There's the same concern. If it's not similar, there's not such a concern, right? If it's close, we'll believe her. But if it's not close, we're not going to believe her. And that's why Beit Hillel made that line, drew the line within the same province, outside the same province. But but in this case, what's the difference if it's the Jordan? What's the difference if it's another river? The whole point was it was in a boat on the river. So it doesn't matter what river it is. Rabbi Hananya ben Akiva amar lecha, after amre, ana da amre afle Beit Shamai. And the other opinion could say, no, I could say like Beit Shamai. The whole logic of this whole idea that we're going to believe her is because we're going to assume she did her homework properly. She's not going to want to get messed up and not be able to go back to her husband. So she's going to do her research, whether it's close, whether it's far. It doesn't matter. She's going to obviously check into it before she starts getting remarried. Because if he shows up, she won't be able to stay married to him anymore. But there, they just wanted us to remember that incident. So because they wanted us to remember that incident, you'll see why and what the incident was in a minute, and then we'll see why they wanted to remember it. In order to remember it, they were gozer b'yarden ubesfina dehava k'maset gazer rabbanan b'sharna wrote lo hava k'maset lo gazer rabbanan. They only wanted to forbid it in a case that was just like that, so we remember that thing. There's no reason to forbid it in other cases. So, my maaseh shayad, amar Rabbi Yehuda amarav, maaseh ba'adam. There was a case where a person, hayam avil mechatat ve'efer chatat ba'yarden ubesfina. Remember, they were extra careful about the purity of the paraduma waters and the ashes. They brought it in the Yarden in a boat, but all of a sudden they found in the bottom of the boat, on the floor of the boat, was a kezayit of a dead body, and then the paraduma waters or ashes had apparently gone over it. The tumah goes up, made it impure, and both, right? It was a tragedy, right? When the red heifer waters or ashes, right? It's so rare that when that gets messed up, wow, that's a tragedy. To remember that event and to be a reminder to people, be very careful with the paraduma waters that they don't become impure. And with the ashes, they basically forbade people to do this again. But again, then the debate becomes, do we forbid it in all sorts of circumstances just in case it happens again like that? Or is the idea really, right, the chances of this happening again are rare? It's just that we want people to remember that this happened once, to be extra careful when they handle it in general, in any place. And therefore, they only made the gzera in the boat in the Jordan, just so that you remember there was such a case, but not that you forbid it in all sorts of other cases. And then this has absolutely nothing to do with our case. And with that, we'll finish for today. Another interesting machlokah Beit Shamai Beit Hillel, the bottom of the daf, which you'll see in tomorrow's daf. Shabbat shalom, everyone, and remember to register for the seal.